All right, welcome back. I know a few people will be trickling in. Thank you for the amazing discussion this morning. And now that we've put those two problems to bed, they're fully solved, we're going to move on to a third challenge, which is, this wording's a little bit different. What would the field of management consider if it took stakeholders seriously? Anita McGann is our session leader here, and I'm going to let her introduce the remainder.
Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you all for being here. And thanks to my now co-authors and longtime friends, Cindy, Sergio, and Claudine, for being here. We also wrote a paper, the four of us, to address the mandate of the conference. I wanted just to set the stage before I turn it over to Cindy to launch us here. So the context for this is a group of us, and many of you in the room were part of this, including Jay and Todd, but also Floor and JW and Kate, and many of the rest of you may have been involved at one stage or another in what we've been meeting for the last few years on what we've been calling something along the lines of the stakeholder turn in strategy, or the new stakeholder theory. That's something that I've been calling this, is the new stakeholder theory. And what we're interested in is thinking about the relationships between organizations, not just for-profit firms, but also nonprofits, governments at all levels, and so on, and the stakeholders that are involved. And to do this with the goal of trying to think about integrating stakeholder insights with our core frameworks in the field of strategy. In other words, we very much want to build on the shoulders of giants in the original stakeholder theory, people like Ed Freeman and Rob Phillips and Jeff Harrison and other friends that have been thinking about moral and ethical perspectives. We want to now take a more descriptive approach to stakeholderism and think about how we can use stakeholder ideas to inform questions about competitive strategy, about corporate strategy, governance, agency problems, and so on. So we want to integrate stakeholder considerations into core frameworks using a more descriptive lens. That's sort of what has motivated us. This new stakeholder theory, which I've written about a little bit, it seeks to be both descriptive and instrumental on the original Donaldson criteria. I happen to believe that almost everything is ethical and moral. Being a business school professor is an ethical decision. Deciding to wear clothes made in China is an ethical decision. Now, having said that, with a background that everything has got an ethical and moral dimension to it, the goal here is to do some more descriptive theorizing to accommodate stakeholders that are grounded in different moral frameworks, okay? So, for example, in my paper with Leo, and I think Leo is here somewhere, I've learned so much from you, Leo, and Sergio, of course, and others about the Amazon rainforest. You've got actors as stakeholders in that context that have different moral frameworks. The tribal communities have different frameworks. The company has a different framework, and they're coming together to do stuff. And instead of saying what should happen as an ethically positive claim, we're saying what does happen given that everybody's interacting from these different points of view. And the goal is to generate, as Jay very kindly has written about, generate measurable predictions for empiricism and to try to formalize stakeholder integration along the lines that I think Asim and Zhao and JW and Floor and others have been working on for a while, and Cindy and Kate. So generating measurable predictions for empiricism so we can actually build theory that takes these claims seriously. There are two canonical questions that I framed early in my work on the new stakeholder theory, and they are, first of all, which stakeholders are in or enfranchised in a situation, and of course the subtext here is that some are out. In other words, Freeman, page 46, I think, on his original textbook, says everybody could be a stakeholder. We're kind of saying, well, not everybody can. If everybody can be, then maybe that means nobody is. We want to think about what are the criteria for stakeholder enfranchisement? And our friends Sophie Bach and Ruth Aguilera have been working on this. There's other great, Garcia Castro, Marvin, many of you have been thinking about enfranchisement. We want to think about that criteria. And then how is value distributed among stakeholders? And that's going to get us to questions of what is value, what is distributing value, and how is the value created in the first place? So these are the two canonical questions here. Which stakeholders are in and who is out, and then who's getting what as a result of their being part of some sort of system. The first question that we have 5 questions that we wanted to cover, and I'm going to ask the folks in the back to turn on the clock for us. Would you turn down the countdown clock? We're going to try to take 7 or 8 minutes per question here, and then have a little dialogue on each of 5 questions led by my colleagues, each one led by my colleagues, and then we're going to, at the end, try to leave at least half an hour for questions. Okay, so here's the first question, and Cindy, I wondered if you would take this on. The question here is about enfranchisement and value creation. Why are these important questions, and who or what are stakeholders in the first place? How should we be thinking about this?
Thank you so much, Anita. And first of all, thank you for bringing us together on this panel. Thank you again to the wonderful organizers for bringing all of us here to Deer Valley on such a beautiful day and such a beautiful time of year. As Anita already mentioned, the canonical questions, and I think this actually applies here just as much, the answers to the 2 canonical questions are very much co-determined, and that's a point that others have made as well, and I think it's a really, really important point that I want to start out with and just kind of throw out there at the very beginning, because I hope it won't get lost in everything else that we have to say. So on these questions, who are stakeholders, who among them are enfranchised or empowered, and who gets what at the end of the day, and what is the what in who gets what? I think obviously a lot has been written already, and a lot more will be written for sure. Part of the answer, and I'm going to start from where I think from what I believe we already know, part of the answer comes from the project or from the goal to be accomplished. Who can provide the resources that we need to build a project? Who knows how to build it? Then who benefits from it? And then who gets hurt? And in thinking about these questions, we're sketching the outlines of who these stakeholders might be. It's a great starting point, but, and of course there is a but, the answer is incomplete. And I'm going to make sort of this argument that I think we need to think more broadly than this, and to do that, I'm going to challenge you with a question. Take AI, for instance, something that we've already started thinking about, and we have a special session dedicated to that too, and try to define the stakeholders for AI. As you're thinking about this, you're probably thinking about the resources it takes to build these models, the computer equipment, the electricity, the data, of course, the algorithms, and the people who know how to build them, so the employees of the AI firms. You're probably also thinking about the customers who are using AI, maybe even about the governments who are trying to put some guardrails around the use of AI. But these models use a lot of data, and some of that data is generated by you and I. Where we go, what we buy, who we talk to, and so on and so on and so forth. And to this particular group, some of the data that's being used by AI models is the things that we publish and the things that we say in our classrooms. Does that make us stakeholders? And if you think a little bit further, right, when our students are using AI models to do whatever it is that they're doing for class, and that pushes us to rethink how we teach and how we evaluate, and in both good and bad ways, are we stakeholders? So here's the thing. I think as we're thinking about this question of, just a very specific questions, who are the stakeholders for AI? I think it's important to also recognize that if we ask the very same question in different countries, we're going to get very different answers. And the reason for that is because of how people think about who matters in society at any point in time. Who has voice, and who has access to organizing, and therefore to organizations. If you take as an example indigenous groups around the world, In Canada, Indigenous communities, First Nations, they are more than stakeholders, and they will insist on that because they have signed treaties with sovereign entities, with the British Crown and later with the Canadian government. And when they have operated at that level, they're not just stakeholders, they're more than that. In other parts of the world, of course, Indigenous groups are deemed irrelevant and inconsequential, so they're completely ignored. This is variation in stakeholder enfranchisement, which doesn't come from the project itself, but from society, from the society's history, the institutions who empower and disempower the members of society. The point that I'm trying to make is that we need to contextualize our understanding of stakeholders, not only relative to a project, but also relative to a location, and to make things even more complicated, relative to time. So I think just as I have no doubt that the answer to the question, who are the stakeholders for AI, is different if we ask the question in the United States or if we ask the question in China, I have no doubt that the answer will be at least a little bit different 10 years from now than it is today. I mentioned China, and I did that on purpose because I really couldn't help to mention that you probably heard that China is developing ChatGPT. Replace the G in GPT with Xi, the name of the supreme leader, and you have ChatGPT. And they're doing this to ensure that the answers provided by AI chatbots are built on socialist values. And perhaps even more specifically than that, on the supreme leader's ideological take on what socialist values should be. Which brings me to the last point I'm trying to make. If we ask this question, who are the stakeholders and who is empowered among them in AI or in any other different domain, we will get, and we ask this question of different people, we will get different answers. And that's because their answer is very much a function of their values, and that's values with an S at the end. So who should be considered as a stakeholder and why is not just a function of the project, it's not just a function of the location or the jurisdiction where the question is adjudicated, but also very much a question or a function of the values of those who decide. I don't think there should surprise any of us that if we ask this question of corporate representatives, we're going to get very different answers than if we ask this question of government agents or union members or communities, or members of communities that are affected by a particular project, or of activists. Right? Every one of their answers reflects their values. People self-select into these roles because of their values, and therefore how they respond in these roles is going to be a matter of their values or their beliefs of what is important and who matters. I'll take it one step further and mention that I believe values, again, values with an S at the end, determine both who is in and who is out, of course, but they're also going to determine who gets what. And not only that, but it's also going to find what should be defining in our models what that what, in who gets what is. Think back to AI and the ChatGPT example, right? If AI is just another way to spread Western ideas around the world, we're hearing very, very clearly that Chinese leaders are telling us that they are going to pass on that and they're going to develop their own. So many conversations around the world today and in this room this morning are about values, right? We are going to have an entire conversation, the whole conversation about ESG that we're going to hear a lot more about is about values. The conversation about the role of firms in society versus the role of government in society is about values. Geopolitics is all about values. So to just sum up, I think so far strategy research has focused very much on value, without the S, value, defined in terms of the size of the pie. And I think in doing that, we have generated, strategy research has generated very productive conversations and really interesting and important insights. But I also think we need to understand what other values are driving stakeholders, how they interact and with whom, that is how they sort themselves into organizations, how they cooperate and with whom they cooperate, how they compete, and of course, who gets what, not just in terms of that nice big pie, but also in terms of other values or other things that matter to them. So I think with that, I'll pass it on to Sergio.
Yes, thank you. So our second question, and these are questions that are intended to set an agenda for our field. That's our goal here around these issues. The second question is, what are the implications of thinking about stakeholders in terms of how we treat organizations as tools for accomplishing stakeholder aims?
Thank you so much for the organizers. Thanks, Anita, for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I'm really honored to be here. Okay, I have an opportunity to talk to the original stakeholder theorists and about this question actually. And the original stakeholder theory is very firm-centric, and there's a reason because it was, in a sense, a reaction to theories based on shareholder maximization. Right?
Yes. Can you hold it a little closer so we can hear you a little better?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So therefore, it is for traditional stakeholder theory, the action is in the organizational level. So you decide, and Ed Freeman, right, as we probably know, and Rob Phillips has this paper called "A Libertarian Defense of Stakeholder Theories," meaning that so we are not interested in political action, or government action or policies, whatever. Are interested in organizations. So, for instance, if you have an institutional environment that that has, for example, labor laws that are not as society would like, so it's not our goal to actually redress that. But organizations can. For instance, have their own labor practices, improve labor practices, and therefore foster cooperation and so on and so on, right? Of course, this opens the question of, okay, so that's it? We focus on organizations or other types of actions. One approach would be, no, we're not going to talk about the institutional environment or policies, etc., and this is for political scientists or economists. However, organizations do influence the institutional environment, right? We know that companies lobby for, changes that can perhaps be perceived positively by society. Other organizations lobby for actually to avoid those improvements, right? And therefore, in strategy, we already have that kind of research happening, which is no market strategies, right? Corporate political activity, research, and so on and so on. So it seems that actually there's an opportunity. So different from this original view of organizational theory, we can perhaps embrace in a predictive way, Anita, right? To predict what types of behaviors that firms can pursue in connecting, not only developing the business model, but connecting with the institutional environment. So, for instance, just to give an example of, and I think that one particularly interesting agenda is to see how the market or business model, business level strategies interact with this kind of no-market agenda. There's a paper, for instance, that finds, it's a formal model that finds that firms with a cost advantage, right? For instance, firms have a cost advantage in environment, clean production, etc. They have incentives to lobby for changes in regulations, policies, etc. that will make those environmental control standards more strict, right? Leandro Nardi and Leandro Nardi was my student, now he's at HEC Paris. So we also have a paper, but also along those lines, but observing differentiation. And we get a different result. So imagine a firm that is creating a business model that is differentiated along the lines of, having improved stakeholder relations, I don't know, with communities or workers or whatever, right? So the firm differentiates and there's a premium price, whatever. Another firm will not follow that kind of positioning. We find that if that firm is profit maximizing, that firm will not have incentives to lobby for, to pursue, advocate changes in institutional environment that will be consistent with the stakeholders that they are kind of targeting. Why that? Because if they do that, the other firm will also be forced to adopt the same practices and the firm will lose the differentiation edge. It will only happen, at least in our model, if the firm is more pro-social, has a pro-purpose, right? Cares about the stakeholders in general. So, in a sense, there are other questions that we are asking, right, related to this one. Enfranchisement in this view will be as a function of the business models that firms craft, but also the actions that they promote at the institutional environment level, right? So it'll be endogenous in a sense. Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, just to very briefly say, I see Bruce, where I thought I saw Bruce Briggs. Basically, one of the ideas here that is on our second slide here for question 2 is this idea that you want to deploy a firm to solve a particular value-creating problem when the pursuit of profit by that firm will be constructive for the firm and for the social group that deploys that organization. There are other types of organizations that may be better suited to solve a particular problem, like a nonprofit or a governmental agency. And the goal is to unleash the profit motive where the profit motive leads to constructive outcomes, in a particular domain. So it's picking up on Jay's idea that you brought up in one of our conferences about a Copernican revolution where the firm isn't quite at the center, as Sergio said. Okay, our third question over to Claudine is about goals.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for creating this conference, Jay. This is really fantastic, and Todd as well. Thank you. So before I get to question 3, I just want to back up and give a little bit of some high-level thoughts. So the organizing question for this panel is sort of how would the field of strategy be different if we take stakeholders seriously? So I'm going to start with a semi-provocative statement, maybe just for us, maybe not for everybody in the room, to say that I think the field of strategy does a decent job already of taking stakeholders seriously up into a point. And so I want to sort of explain sort of where I think we actually do a very good job of taking stakeholders seriously, and then where we run up against limits of not doing such a great job. And I'll do it through a story. So I teach a class on strategy implementation, and I bring in a bunch of speakers. And one of the most interesting days that we bring in is on stakeholders. And how do you manage stakeholders? How do you manage strategy in the context of multiple stakeholders? So looking outwards as opposed to looking inwards. And the speakers that I bring in are the former chairwoman and board director, who also happened to be an ambassador to the UN, of PG&E Corporation. So PG&E Corporation is the largest utility in the country, and they happened to kill about 100 people in the course of setting off some really vicious wildfires in California in 2018 and 2019. And so we bring them in to talk about, you come into a company that's just killed 100 people. How did you think about stakeholders in the course of doing strategy there? And so in that sense, strategy actually, the way that we do strategy and the way that they thought about it actually decently maps for the first 80% of the conversation. So we come up with 30 stakeholder groups on the board, the creditors, the fire victims, the governor's office, the customers, which they call ratepayers, the suppliers, the employees. You can come up with about 30 groups of stakeholders that are all have an interest in PG&E in bankruptcy. And then you can talk about how do they negotiate their way out of there. And a lot of the standard tools we have work pretty well. Coalition formation, interest alignment, where do interests diverge, where do interests come together, where can you create value, and just sort of standard stuff that I think we have pretty good tools for. Now, where I think the field falls, doesn't do such a good job in describing what happens here is where we get into these situations of competing goods or competing oughts. Meaning that across these stakeholder groups, back to what Cindy said, there's values that are different, and how do you prioritize in a non-pecuniary way some stakeholder interests over others? That doesn't work very well in this sort of coalition formation, sort of welfare type of framework. And there, when you listen to the chairwoman and of the group and how they think about it, it's really an ethical reason. It's a moral reasoning problem that they engage in. It's not a value maximization. It's not a social welfare maximization. The whole sort of idea of stakeholders versus shareholders, they think is nonsense. They're like, it only is talked about in universities. We don't even think about it like that. We think about what are the competing equities involved, and then how do we prioritize some equities over others in a moral reasoning kind of way, not in a sort of standard kind of way. And that's where I think we don't have a great job of understanding that in an academic context. So I guess what I want to propose here is something that's come up already. Dennis has mentioned it. I think Bruce has mentioned it. Rajshri has mentioned it. I think that there's other tools that have evolved in other fields that we have underused in our field to think about this kind of stuff. And so one of those tools is thinking about Ken Arrow and social choice. And it's already come up here in the context that people have not just value, but values. And how do you aggregate those into a social choice that a firm does? So just because you internalize a choice inside an organization, you haven't solved the social choice problem. You've just changed the locus of where the choice is. And so really trying to understand, we don't just have value in society, we have values. We have to navigate through those values. We can try to farm out as much as we can to the political process, but we can't farm out 100%. Firms still need to make political decisions. They still need to aggregate in a social choice type of way. They have some advantages over the government because we have dictators, right? That was sort of Arrow's solution to his impossibility theorem, but we also have exit. And so these dictators are not unconstrained dictators. They are people that need to work in a competitive capitalist context to solve these social choice problems. So I think that within the tools of strategy, thinking about moral values, which we've already thought some people in this room have done some really great work on, but in economics, Ben Abu-Tirol have done work on moral economics, Arrow, Oliver Hardin and Luigi Zingales have thought about shareholder welfare maximization as opposed to shareholder value maximization. Some of these tools, importing them and taking them more seriously, I think would help overcome where we're bucking up against these boundaries.
Amazing, thank you. My values on Friday night are not the same as on Monday morning. In other words, just these trade-offs are complicated. Thank you so much. Cindy,
I didn't talk about purpose. It's okay.
That's okay. We'll come back to purpose. Getting alignment and purpose is a managerial problem. That's part of the idea that we also promote. So we've written up this paper with sub-questions that we would refer you to. Leadership and management is about trying to manage these things and getting alignment. Thank you, Claudine. So Cindy, I'm going to tax you again here on question 4 about trade-offs and the role of governance, organizational governance, in shaping purpose.
The questions just get easier, right?
Yeah.
So I actually think this is a really tricky one because I would suggest that we need to flip the question. And as I was thinking about this, I looked back at the note that we wrote in the very first sentence, and I want to quote it in response to this question, is as tools for accomplishing stakeholder aims, organizations establish governance processes through which authority is established, decision processes are formed, and rights are allocated, end quote. And the reason I write that sentence is because it implies a sequence that the aim comes first and then the governance comes later. And if I go kind of down the path of trying to build this a little bit further, I would add that, well, first of all, we would have to ask where the aim comes from, so that we have to attribute to a sort of small group of people who get together trying to define and accomplish an aim. The aim itself is going to tell us what kind of resources we need and what kind of knowledge, and that's going to define the stakeholders. And then the stakeholders, well, obviously the initial group with some of the stakeholders in mind, and these stakeholders' values in mind, define the governance mechanism, essentially who decides, how they decide, and who gets what. I think here a nice example is corporate foundations. I think in those situations, the very moment the goal itself has changed, a need for a completely different governance mechanism became apparent, which led to the establishment of a very separate organizational identity that separated the corporation from the foundation itself. You, Anita, have written about the Mass General Hospital establishing an NGO to deliver healthcare services in parts of Africa. I leave it to you to tell us a little bit more about that if you'd like. But if I were to take a position on this particular question, I think it's important. I would argue that it starts with the aim or with the purpose, which shapes the stakeholder group, and then from there the governance itself. But I think we have the question, we really don't have the answers.
Sergio, did you want to add a little bit here?
Yeah, I can talk more about comparative governance, right? Because since Coase and Williamson, we know that all organizational forms have flaws and merits, and especially depending on the type of stakeholder and the conditions that you need to, consider to do whatever you want to do. So for instance, consider the case of communities in underdeveloped urban areas. Leo Pongelupi has papers on that, on slums, favelas, right? It's extremely difficult to reach those communities at the last mile, at the very last mile. Marginal costs are really high, right? It's really complicated. Have lots of things are missing, and therefore for for-profit firms it's really complicated to do. They may not even have the capabilities to do that. So therefore there is a role of nonprofits, even the government, right, which also have costs, right? So governments, for instance, is well known, have big agency problems and so on, incentive problems. From a comparative perspective, however, we need to consider all those organizations, right, in that kind of solution, right? It's kind of a more plural view, right, of those governance. It's comparative work. We already have comparative work along those lines happening. Jiao and Nassim they have a beautiful paper on so comparing organizational forms, several others. Subi also was a pioneer on constructive partnerships. Also, there's this literature on public-private collaborations and so on. That kind of comparative analysis is necessary.
And JW and Floor and AMR in 2022.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, yeah.
Good. So these are just teasers in a way. We have a lot more to say about each of these things, and I'm going to press forward, Claudine, and ask you if you would mind just answering this big picture question, which is, what do we miss by not taking stakeholders seriously?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for those of us. So I don't think I've written sort of a stakeholder paper per se. So I count myself more as like a mainstream strategy person. And so from that perspective, I actually think there's a lot of opportunity for adopting some of these ideas and sort of even, outside of sort of what would be traditionally thought about as stakeholder strategy, even though there's a lot there too. And so let me just give a couple of thoughts along these lines. So firstly, to the extent that we're a descriptive science, we're missing a lot of descriptive power by not thinking about this kind of stuff. So, when you just think about, for instance, some of the biggest challenges that the large tech firms are facing right now. And, again, I would, maybe the cynics would say it's profits versus purpose, but I think a lot of it is sort of competing equities, right? So you have to make a choice between openness and moderation. That creates tensions for you that are ethical tensions. They're not necessarily just profit versus purpose tensions. And so how do companies create principles that they act, that drive their strategic decisions, that are not necessarily always about value maximization, but are about sort of hierarchies of principles, that some companies create one set of hierarchies and other companies create other hierarchies, and how are those hierarchies formed? What are the aggregation mechanisms, going back to Arrow, that create some hierarchies of principles that create action in one direction for one set of companies and in another direction for other sets of companies. You think about Facebook, OpenAI, Google, some of these big quandaries that these tech firms are in, I think are about what the hierarchies of principles that they've created are. And that I don't think is easily addressed without thinking about this type of logic as well. So I think that that's one thing that we're missing, is actually descriptive of how companies make these strategic decisions. The other thing that I think we're missing is, and this goes back to the part where I didn't talk about purpose, which is like all I've been working on for 10 years, so it's kind of a bummer. But, when you think about some of the big trends that we've seen since, I guess, in the last 20 years, one of them is an increasing recognition that firms are social actors, right now just economic actors. I think that's already come up a lot in this today. And then another is just this increasing reliance on creativity and innovation. When you look at companies' balance sheets, they're completely inverted from where they were 30 years ago, where they're all based off intangibles right now. Knowledge, creativity, ideas, which really, from a contract economics perspective, those are non-contractable, right? Those are, employees and external people coming in and really generating ideas that you can't put down on a piece of paper or trade easily. And so I think without really understanding how values play into that, and how you align values with people that have different values, how you select in and select out, and just define these boundaries of who these stakeholders are that are putting forth effort because you're sort of activating the values that they have. I think we're missing a lot of where great strategies come from. And so, I was just at Yale. They have like a Purpose Institute there, and they've done, I think over COVID, it was great because all the CEOs were at home and they were on Zoom. And so they interviewed about 100 CEOs on the role of purpose in their companies. And for them, it's really about adaptability. Like, that's where their strategies come from. They start with the why of why they're doing what they're doing, what are the undergirding values, and then from there, the strategic goals come and the choices come. And so I think without taking that stuff seriously, we miss a lot about where great strategies and great innovation and great creativity come from. So that's my take on this.
Thank you.
That's very interesting, of course, central question. One approach in strategy would be, let's keep our focus on for-profit or profit maximization, etc. But companies, like it or not, they are talking about stakeholders. They are investing in those strategies. And some of those firms are actually doing harm, or Anita, Peter, they have this concept of public bets, right? So this idea that, so my favorite example is Tom's Shoes. I don't know if you have this example. So this company created, the idea was a classic differentiation model, selling shoes for at premium prices. Every shoe that a customer will buy, the company will donate another pair to children in developing countries. Nice, right? It's good. It seems to be like but studies have found that when those, actually very rigorous studies, experiments, actually RCTs, children receiving those shoes, they were actually not improving in terms of health, because one theory was that they were be less exposed to food diseases, right? That was not happening. Furthermore, there was evidence that they were kind of reducing time studying, right? Because they were getting those shoes and playing or something along those lines. And also there were complaints that they were actually dumping free shoes in developing countries. So local producers or manufacturers were actually complaining that they were, dumping shoes there. So it's really bad, right? So then they changed the strategy. So this is it seems to me that it's something along those lines. Okay, we hear about stakeholders, so let's craft those nice strategies without understanding what they want, what they need, who are those folks, their values, etc., etc.
There are so many examples of, in the category of bad strategy, of not understanding the impact on communities of, for example, providing a well that becomes disruptive of cultural traditions, or of privatization of prisons that causes less investment in prisoner education, for example. So lots of examples there. So the conclusion here is that we're just getting started on this agenda of trying to understand what it will take to really integrate into the field of strategy a comprehensive understanding of the very complicated ways in which we as social actors attach value to things, and how that value can be pursued through profitable business models as a consequence. And then all the degrees in which different stakeholders may be in or out, the kinds of claims that they have. We don't have full agreement on core tenets, including understandings of value and of distribution and of enfranchisement. The agenda that we have is just the tip of an iceberg. So thank you for your kind attention, and we have quite a bit of time now for your comments and remarks, and I look forward to hearing them. Thank you. Okay, can I borrow that back? And do we have questions? Thank you, Todd. Comments? Deepak. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, and an excellent panelist, as with all the panels today. Really great listening to you. Deepak Somaya from Illinois. I was thinking throughout as you were describing this, and I think to some extent, Sergio sort of began to touch on this aspect, which is a question of boundaries. So when we have stakeholder concerns, what is the legitimate boundary of what firms should take on as opposed to other actors, especially political actors? And this is something that we're increasingly seeing contestation around who should address. I mean, just look at Florida and the whole Disney thing was an example, right? And I feel we don't have good ways of thinking about this, thinking about political failure, thinking about, comparative organization, as you were describing as well.
Yeah. Well, it's great, Deepak. We already have comparative governance work emerging, as I said. So Jiao and Assim, so they, for instance, they characterize different types of organization forms, public-private, depending on the extent of externalities involved, production economies, etc. I myself also have, work in this area. So it's growing, but we need more. And I know that you and Tomas, right, you are examining educational, Tomas Teodorovics, examining the role of public versus private schools, right, or non-profit. And there are also very interesting tensions emerging because, for instance, if you consider vulnerable populations that cannot pay for a given, educational service, right? They are constrained. Bruce mentioned, inability to pay, right? So then you could have, for instance, a solution which is vouchers, right, to those families. But we know that those things are really imperfect because for-profit firms will be selective in the types of students that they admit, right? So in the sense that there is a role of governments, non-profits, right? In your work, right, you show that that governments have a role, non-profits, but for-profit firms, on the other hand, they scale more, right? So they have this ability because the for-profit motive, it is bad for those kind of more vulnerable student groups, but it's good for scalability, right? Trade-offs. I think it is comparative, right? We need to, it's a Williamsonian, Coasian. We need to analyze the pros and cons, alternative organizational arrangements, and the trade-offs involved.
Nanja from University of Southern California. Thanks so much for the tremendous efforts of the scholars of stakeholder management on the stage and also in the room. That I'll say that many, I'm not going to say all, so that I don't have the burden of proof, many in the field accept the importance of stakeholder engagement. I was wondering if you guys can help us, give us a summary of what we already know about the effective ways to engage stakeholders. And to that, I'm particularly thinking about the issue of governance that we started talking about. For example, do we need to design the formal governance such that the stakeholders have a seat on the table for it to happen? Since you, for example, raised the example of the First Nations in Canada, they have formal authority over a lot of things. Or is it that we need to change the shared value where informal governance would do the trick? Or what do we know already about in that regard?
Yeah, and then can you repeat the last part of your question, or?
So is it the formal so do we have to give these stakeholders a seat on the formal on the table, or can we just count on some informal governance to maybe achieve those goals, or with some sort of intertwining of like integration of these two? I'm just curious of what do we know already about these issues?
I think what we know is that it's a mix of the two, right? That formal governance cannot include everyone, and Anita has written about, thinking about both who's in, who's out, but also how do you adapt over time. But having said that, informal governance, essentially relational contracts, are incredibly important to play an incredibly important role to compensate for that or to complement that, right? So earlier this year, Veet, Lita, and I finally published an article in which we're looking at firm stakeholder dialogue. That's just sort of a conversation or the beginning of a conversation between firms and stakeholders, and we're looking at how valuable that is depending on the informational environment in which it happens. And we see that sometimes it's really, really critical. and sometimes it's not. But it's a way of saying that informal governance, that starts with simply recognizing the stakeholder. I think that's the most important first step, is really, really important in shaping the relationships. But I would say that I think we probably would all agree that it's impossible to bring everybody under the tent.
Can I just tell you briefly about that Indigenous example? Just a brief. I'm on a board in Canada, and in Canada, as you said, there's a requirement for Indigenous consultation before you can take on a major project of any kind as a firm in Canada. Like, for example, if you want to build a new plant, or if you want to extend a transportation route or something, there's got to be an Indigenous consultation. And we had on our board a leader of the Mississaugas of the New Credit under Treaty 13. That's our territorial area in Toronto, and his name is Stacy. So consult with Stacy. Stacy says, I don't like strategy. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm not going to even talk with you about it. Boom, it's over. You have to build a relationship and trust, in order to even have the conversation. So there's the intertwining between the formal and the informal. But by the way, this turned out well. We had a long conversation in which he told me he didn't like strategy. I said I didn't really like it that much either, but we really should have one, because if we don't have a strategy, we're not going to be able to make any progress together. Finally, we got around to an agreement, and I happened to turn on the CBC I think I told you this, Kate, turned on the CBC the next morning, and there was Stacy being interviewed by Matt Galloway, who is the sort of flagship interviewer on the morning Canadian version of the BBC or of NPR, saying, what the Mississaugas of the New Credit need is a strategy. And so we won him around. But it is a trust build, formal and informal intertwine when you're trying to actively align interests in the way we're discussing, in ways that go well beyond just a declaration of interests or a declaration of values. We have to explore how we can create new things together that we don't even know we can do until we have the conversation. Sorry to take up time.
Can I add to that just one thought, kind of connecting it to back to values, right? I think it's important to emphasize in Anita's example that this idea that we meet and how we bring our lawyers along and we sign formal contracts is such a Western view of the world and of sort of, ways of thinking about property rights. And the moment we step outside that, the ways of building relationships, the ways of having conversations, whose wedding whose daughter's wedding do you attend, and what kind of drink you drink, and how do you start the relationship of a conversation, those change tremendously because of the values that change when we step up.
So we'll go to Asim, and then Todd, you have, okay, great, Olga.
Okay, Asim Kaur, Minnesota. I feel like I should say something because I guess I'm a stakeholder of the stakeholder theory literature. I'm not entirely sure if I'm in or I'm out or whatever, but anyway. So I guess two things that, this was a really interesting conversation, but I thought two things that I was hoping to hear more about, so I'm just going to put them out there and you folks should feel free to comment or tell me I'm completely wrong. I probably am. One is that, we were talking a little bit about sort of public bads and sort of unintended consequences, but I feel like we're not sufficiently engaging with the fact that a lot of strategies are built on exploitation, right? Think about every opioid manufacturer out there. Think about Facebook. Think about the addictive properties of social media. Think about all of these other. Anita's written some stuff about the use of convict labor, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of these kind of strategies where it's not an unintended consequence that we're creating negative impact for people. There's an intended consequence that we're creating negative impact for people. And, I've done some work on pollution havens, which is all about let's just get out of this country where there's good environmental regulation and go to other places, right? So I guess I'm curious about when we talk about taking stakeholders seriously, where does that sort of, we're taking stakeholders very seriously. We're thinking very hard about how to not benefit stakeholders and how that can lead to value creation potentially, right? The second point is, I'm also struck by the fact that when we talk about taking stakeholders seriously, we're still sort of mostly talking about them as sort of relatively passive, and if not entirely passive, then fairly good-natured, very nice people who are doing good things, right? But I would argue, for example, the entire agency literature is a stakeholder literature because employees are stakeholders and employees behave badly, right? And I would argue customers behave badly and governments behave badly, and right. So I guess I'm also wondering about the sort of notion of where do stakeholders behaving badly and taking advantage of things really fit into this kind of notion of, and I will just connect that to Bruce's discussion of political leanings, right? I also feel like a lot of times, perhaps because of the ideological makeup of these groups, we're often talking about, examples which are very, things that we like that firms are doing, but there are a lot of examples of firms that, like think about all the firms that are sort of partnering with the NRA to sort of sell more rifles. And Chris Poliquin is here somewhere, I don't know where he is. Chris, where are you? Ah, there you are. Wow. Chris has some wonderful, wonderful work sort of thinking about these topics, right? So I guess, again, I'm curious about sort of the negative side of stakeholders and how do we take that seriously?
Are you going to gather more? Or? Okay. So firstly, Asim, we can always count on you for bringing up the cynical negative side of the world. So. But I'm really glad you. But I'm really glad you did. So for me, especially the first point that you made is one that's like something that I think about all the time. I wrote a paper on when do purpose and profits go together and when do they go apart. And sometimes they go together and the world is wonderful. And there's a great quote by Larry Fink that says, purpose is not, antithetical to profits. In fact, it's the means by which profits exist. Always goes together with profits, right? And then there's the cynics that say, let's just be honest, this is all nonsense and it's just a way of companies covering themselves up to do these, to sell more, we're creating life-saving medicines, but really what they're doing is pushing pills to people and overcharging people that can't. And so I think that this is probably one of the first order questions, and I don't think it's one that I think a lot of people think about in economics. I think it's one that we should be thinking about more in strategy and understanding when these things are complements and when they're substitutes. And when they're substitutes and when they do a lot of harm, then, not relying on the better angels of firms to act always in the best of society, but that's where government steps in. And looking for where these pitfalls are. I think that can be one of the biggest contributions that we can make as a field in this area, is to really understand, do we rely on Mark Zuckerberg's better angels to solve teenage bulimia? Or is there a commercial solution to this? Maybe there's a competitor that can come in that can actually be more socially responsible and people will go to that, or is that something where you actually need regulation for? And I don't know that we understand the boundaries of where these things are complements and where these things are substitutes well enough to actually answer your question properly. But I think it would be great if we could develop that over the next decade or so.
Okay, Olga is next.
Can I answer, Anita? Can I answer
sure.
the second question?
Yes, and then we'll go to Olga.
Yeah, so thank you. About the negative stakeholders, right? So actually, I'm also not the original kind of stakeholder management researcher, but so I was doing research on, and I do research on public-private collaborations. In that literature, have lots of discussions on that, and not necessarily labeled as stakeholders. So Pablo Spiller, for instance, has this concept of third-party opportunism. So for instance, if you're a private firm, you sign a contract with a government to build a road or to manage a road, then certain constituencies, society may actually push or try to make pressure, right, to reduce prices, tolls, for instance, right? And this can be very negative for investment, etc. So I guess we don't need to have a positive. I think we need to have a neutral view and see what are their interests, right? How they're engaging in those discussions, what they want, what do they want, etc., etc. Thank you.
Olga Hon, UNC Chapel Hill. So to be useful to people in this room, I'd like to take us back to that question on the whiteboard and ask you guys. So since you mentioned that strategy field actually takes stakeholders seriously, but up to a point, So why do you think that is? Why it is up to the point? And the point of what? And is it due to methodological or data limitations that we face? Is it the unintended consequences that practitioners would love to predict, right? So why a field that's forward-looking, studying interdependencies, why can we go deeper and why can we go all the way?
So this is, I actually would be curious to hear what other people, this group think versus just us, because I think that this is a really interesting question. So I've been thinking a lot about values and about sort of the arrow, bringing arrow to strategy recently. Todd and I have a paper right now that's actually trying to expand the theory of the firm in a social choice framework, and also thinking about. So John Dewey has this idea of you express your moral values by what problems you want to solve. So we all care about, you can probably say, most people in this room care about a similar set of problems, right? We care about climate change and pollution and, human rights, but we rank those differently. And so what problems we choose to take up, and that sort of is similar to firms' purposes, right? This is sort of what purpose does, right? It sort of articulates, here's the problem that we really care about. And we're going to select for employees that care about that problem. And we're going to get motivated on that problem. And it's this sort of a selection mechanism in this sort of arrow world where people's values are different. And so I have a theory about this, but I don't know if this is like the right theory. This is just like my working hypothesis on how this works. So I've been reading a lot of the history of sort of the development of social sciences over the 20th century. And there was a lot of debates around this at the beginning of the 20th century. So like Frank Knight, we'll have a session on uncertainty in Frank Knight, but Frank Knight thought a lot about ethics and economics. Like the Chicago School thought a lot about ethics and economics in the 50s. And you look at some of the founders of our field, like Chester Barnard and Mary Parker Follett and Selznick on the sociological side, they thought a lot about values. And then there was sort of a piece in the mid-20th century that said, and maybe this was the reaction to like whose values? This, you can't build a social science on values because there's no numeraire, right? There's no way of building a theory on it. It's just descriptive. And so there was a real effort to get values out because you couldn't sort of build, good theory on it. And I know there's a great quote about Simon saying this, right? There's no social science with morality in it, right? That's separate. So I think that up to the point is because of just the way that the sociology of our field evolved. But I think you can actually build a good descriptive science on it. I think economics is doing that now. So I think it's good time. So that's my theory. I don't know what the other people's thoughts are.
Is this working? Yeah. In some sense, I think you're too humble and this is maybe also talking to Anita with the label new stakeholder theory, because Flora and I, for instance, at some point have claimed that what is going on here in these discussions is not so much new stakeholder theory, it's new strategy theory. And in some sense, that's what we're here for, right? For this conference. Sorry, this better? Too loud? Oh, sorry. J.W. Stoelhorst, University of Amsterdam. So I was saying that maybe we're too humble in this discussion, in the sense that maybe this new stakeholder theory is more a new strategy theory. And also linking back to the previous panels, I think there's at least two things going on in the discussion here. We've been quite focused on firm performance, and we've typically identified that with profit. And in doing so, implicitly or explicitly, we've had a shareholder primacy perspective. And of course, this is what people have been stepping away from. Russ started that with his work in the 90s already, and it brought us to strategic human capital research. And then from that, Jay has the 2018 SMJ, which is a stakeholder take on the RBV. I have a paper that sort of follows up on that. All of that still, in some sense, is taking the economic logic. But what we're doing, I think, and what you are doing in this discussion is at least two things. First, we're bringing in values, so norms. And econ is not particularly good at doing that, not at least in the traditional sense. It's about self-interest, it's about rationality, and of course we have behavioral strategy looking at bounded rationality, but we haven't really been looking at what you might call bounded self-interest. So we need to bring in values. And then we are maybe on the way to a new strategy theory, I would say. The second thing you're doing, and this also relates back to the previous discussions, we're going to another level of analysis. So we're going to a systems level and social welfare. And we've never really been interested in that. You know, we sort of bought into the econ story that the market will take care of things, a perfect market, or otherwise the government will take care of externalities. But we know that that doesn't happen in the real world. So in some sense, I think we can be less humble. We maybe want to redevelop strategy. That's what we're here for. And I think the questions you're raising are really important for that. But now my question would be, and I sort of have my own preference in an answer, but I won't go there. Where do we go?
Right.
If it's not traditional econ, if it's not even organizational economics, because that also doesn't really bring in values, where do we go? So there's maybe stuff in econ that you can talk about. There's maybe stuff somewhere else. If we go to a high level of analysis, where do we go? Do we go to Ostrom? Do we go? Where do we go? So what is your take on if we not just want to have a new stakeholder theory, but a new strategy theory, which I think is what we're here for? Where do we look for the theoretical foundations beyond what we've already been doing with stakeholder resource-based theory?
Can I just intervene just for 1 second? We have a little bit of a queue. Martin, and then we're going to go to Veet. And over here we have Dennis has been very patient, and then Vanessa was in the queue. So remind me if I've forgotten the order of operations here, but Martin is next. Can I just ask you, JW, before you do cede the floor, if you could just say one more sentence or two more sentences about your own interest in the answer to that question. And then we'll take a few more comments and then turn it back to the panel to respond.
Thank you. I said I wouldn't go there, but thanks. I think there is stuff out there, sort of an interdisciplinary flavor of social science that is rooted in an evolutionary view of what we are as humans. We are self-interested, but we're also cooperative. We cooperate to create value, we compete to appropriate it. We know that. We've been thinking like that since Brandenburg and Stewart at least. But there is a science out there, an interdisciplinary evolutionary social science that maybe can give us some foundations. That's where my bet is.
JW has been working really hard on that, so thank you for answering that question.
Thank you. So I don't know much about stakeholder theory, but I'm thinking about this from the broader lens of strategy. And it seems to me that traditionally strategy models the company as an autonomous island in an ocean where the mediating force is the market. And I mean, sometimes that's the case, right? You have stable relationships, stable power relationships, knowable situations, stable competitors. But sometimes the context is more important than the economic island. Undefined roles, lots of stakeholders. So my first question I'd be interested in the panel's opinion on is, how do you know whether your results, your performance is mainly driven by the context or mainly driven by your own decisions? And if it is driven by the context, I'm wondering where we are on a playbook for creating something which, where the market doesn't determine the answer, a governance mechanism, a decision mechanism involving other stakeholders has to be constructed. What is that playbook? And you've said it's not as simple as always do this, it's contingent on the situation, but from a practitioner's perspective, what is the playbook for creating that external governance system?
Dennis. Okay, and then
okay, thank you.
Sorry,
Dennis Yao, Harvard. So I wanted to bring together a couple of things. One is there's been this general discussion in the background of Mintzberg, okay? And then we've also talked about descriptive versus normative things. And I think the two sort of come together with the, taking stakeholders seriously, because the question is, do firms actually have the ability to look at stakeholders and do this kind of, let's say, values, goals, and then options kind of approach? Or is it the case that basically they don't know what to do, and so they're kind of stepping back, and what they get are options, and then they choose, okay? So a lot of what happens in public policy is it's really hard to solve a complex public policy problem. And oftentimes what happens is you have options and you choose from those options. And here's where Mintzberg comes in. If you're choosing from options that are given to you because of the stakeholders in question or whatever, your strategy, your stakeholder strategy is emergent. It's not a choice. And so in terms of description versus normative, I think we have to look at both of those things, because I think in the world, there's a lot of description and it's not perfect for reasons I think that there exist. We'd like to move towards something more normative. We're not there yet. Maybe the work of all of us will get us there.
Veet Henish from the Wharton School. First of all, it's fantastic to hear this broad discussion around stakeholder theory in this strategic management conference. Thanks to Anita, the panelists, and everyone. I want to come back to Asim's point, though, because I think it's really critical. From what we've heard, one could reasonably ask, why aren't we all doing this? Why don't all firms do it? We learn more from our stakeholders. Stakeholders contribute resources. Stakeholders contribute value. When you go into the boardrooms with mining companies, oil and gas companies, the first thing you'll hear when you say, well, why don't you empower your stakeholders? Why don't you enfranchise your stakeholders? Is this sort of slippery slope argument. As soon as you do this, as soon as you enfranchise labor, they'll demand more. And they'll demand more at the expense of value creation in the future. Since you and I have been in mine sites where someone opportunistically grabbed a square meter of land at the bottom of a mine pit and said, well, under no circumstances will this be developed, even if it's in the interest of everyone else in the community. I own this meter and I have a veto right, and you're not developing the site. How has the Black empowerment movement worked in South Africa in terms of corruption and people taking advantage of the legal right of certain groups to have standing to divert resources away from community interests towards self-interested elites who share a racial identity? So there are real questions about how we sanction stakeholders who are opportunistic. It's not just firms. Firms can be opportunistic, and we know they are, and we've heard a lot of good examples. But stakeholders who are enfranchised can also be trying to grab and protect value for their identity group, their geographic group, their racial group, their religious group. And what I haven't heard from the panel, and what I haven't heard in the discussions, is what's the sanctioning mechanism? In the firms, we know what the sanctioning mechanism is, right? You can be fired, you cannot be promoted, all sorts of things can happen to you which reduce your standing or your income or your power inside a firm. But what's the sanctioning mechanism for opportunistic stakeholders? If we don't address that, we're never going to answer the corporate executive or the board member who says, that all sounds nice, but there's a downside that your theory isn't explaining. How do we punish the opportunistic stakeholder? And we've got to answer that in this theory.
Thank you. I've got Vanessa. How about we take a few more and then we go back to the panel? So then you're going to Vanessa, and who do you have? And then Gautam, and then Mike, and then Rafaela, and then we'll go back to the panel, okay? Let's see how much time we have after we do that. Vanessa, you're up next, I think?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Bourbano from Columbia. Thanks for this really interesting conversation. I just wanted to sort of reflect on thinking about what I was hearing the panel say and the last session. I think when we think about what strategic management research has to say if we take stakeholders seriously, I think it's a very different perspective if we view stakeholders as inputs to, moderators of, antecedents to how firms create and capture value. That fits much more neatly within, I think, how we currently do research, how we currently think of our DV, how we currently think of our unit of analysis. Is if we conceptualize stakeholders as these individuals and entities who are being affected by choices made by firms, and that it is inherently important to understand those implications and those outcomes, then I think that just really blows up in a big way what the implications are for what kind of research questions we should be asking, what the DV should be that we focus on, what our unit of analysis should be. What if is it important to understand the effects on employee happiness and well-being? What if we discover that employee happiness actually leads employees to shirk and not be particularly motivated? Are we still interested in sort of that as an outcome? So I'd be curious as to what you think about that. And then just one quick second point is, hearing all of this talk about stakeholders, one thing that I was thinking about is that stakeholders are, at the end of the day, individuals and groups of individuals. And so to me, that points to an opportunity for there to be sort of more of a micro lens, perhaps, to take to answering these types of questions and having something to say here. And do you think there's been enough of that, and do you think we need more of that?
And then you have Gautam, and then Mike, and then Rafaela, and then we'll see where we are. Gautam?
Gautam Ahuja, Cornell. This is not an area that I really engage with much, but in a sense, I'm going to mirror Asim. The obvious way I'm asking the question is going to be a cynical one, but under it is a set of questions which are very real, which is, I haven't heard very much about the role of institutions in a market economy and how that addresses this problem or how that interacts with this problem. Because there is a legal structure in an economy which privileges one type of shareholder or one type of stakeholder over all others. There's also an incentive structure built into the economy, most notably in the form of a stock market, right? You have a 3-cent miss on earnings, and basically the stock price collapses, and that's the end of all the stakeholder view in the world, right? So it's like Mike Tyson. Everybody has a strategy till the first punch lands. And so my point is, basically, given that there are these market institutions, how do we incorporate this? What are the research questions that are telling us, okay, maybe are we thinking about different types of ownership structures, for instance, not the public corporation? We know private equity doesn't do any better for sure. So what else is possible there? Or at the same time, are we considering the possibility of different institutional structures so that the status of different stakeholders is kind of changed as it stands today? So, or is there an impact of changing the ownership structure on the behavior? For instance, US corporations are almost very largely now owned by, or the single largest shareholder is index funds. We are no longer a world of equity-owned companies. In fact, the share of debt in US corporations is now more than that of the shareholders. So is that a way, so are these institutional changes going to be helpful or hurtful for our setup, and how seriously should we take them?
Mike Lennox, Darden, UVA. We're creating almost a false dichotomy between the idea of purpose-driven versus profit-driven. And I think actually as strategists, we have a way out of this conundrum, though it recognizes the complexity of the world we live in. If you haven't had the opportunity, I encourage everyone to go look at some of the mission statements of companies. It seems pretty obvious for us to do. But there are fascinating examples out here of purpose-driven companies that vary wildly from one another. Read Hobby Lobby, Christian-based organization, versus Patagonia, or Starbucks versus Black Rifle Coffee. What I struggle with is I think there's a values judgment we're all placing on what is a value-based company. I actually believe every company is a value-based company, and I actually think the values-based probably predates the choice of strategic positioning. But it's very hard then to look at a company, in my personal opinion, and suggest that it is a values-based or not values-based company, other than to impose my own values on them. And I think that seems to be some of the trap we're falling into as we have these conversations. And I think, again, we have an advantage because we talk about strategic positioning. By the way, both Hobby Lobby and Patagonia have very viable, profitable strategic positions in the marketplace there. And some might argue diametrically opposed sets of values that they're pursuing. So I encourage us to get away from some of these false dichotomies and not at least recognize that when we talk about social value, if we're being completely blunt with ourselves, we're talking about typically a bunch of liberal progressive values that many of us in this room, including myself, probably subscribe to. But there are other values out there that are completely different and still driving the behavior of firms. It makes it very hard as a researcher to study what will firms do. But I think we just need to recognize that kind of just fundamental tension in all of these questions we're debating here.
Rafaela Sadun, HBS. So I'm not an expert in this area. I found the conversation really interesting. I think I'm asking myself a question related to the earlier panels of what would be the benefit of studying this type of questions in strategy. What's the value add of doing this in strategy? And for example, relative to economics, even in this panel, I heard two very different stories. GW, I think you were saying economics doesn't care so much about these things, or, it's not canonical. But Claudine, I think you were coming at this from a different angle. I think if I heard you correctly, you're saying there is a lot of work in economics that is being done on these topics, and we in strategy have perhaps an opportunity to build on this work. So the question is more for you. I thought you were super clear in your explanations. But I'd like to understand a little bit better what's in your mind the benefit of arbitraging what's happening in economics into strategy. I can think of perhaps us looking differently at how we measure output of companies. So that connects to the ESG discussion. It could be us looking more at the inputs, and maybe your purpose discussion gets into this. It's a way of coordinating and aligning. But perhaps, maybe that's the biggest opportunity. It's us teaching other people how to take values into considerations once they make decisions. And so creating, ways of approaching decision-making that facilitate that aggregation problem you were discussing before. I'm just curious to hear your views.
So I'm going to suggest, and I can't see the clock, but you can, that you each take a third or so of the amount of time, maybe a little less than a third of the time available, because we've been rushed through all these ideas, and just provide a few thoughts. You don't have to take the whole time, but no more than a third of the time, please. And just each of you respond to some of these points, starting with Cindy, please.
So thank you so much for the questions, the comments, the thoughts, the feedback. I can't agree more with sort of the comments that were offered, and I can't also emphasize more that we don't have the answers to most of these things, but I'll try to cherry pick on a few things that I think I can. So to JW, I think the thing that you're thinking about, the evolutionary social choice, right? The main insight there is that humans are the only species who have understood really, really well through an evolutionary process that within groups, individuals that are behaving very sort of selfishly will win over others. But when you introduce competition between groups, it's really the groups that have the most cooperation that win over others. And I think taking that insight and bringing it to stakeholder theory, and I think to strategy more broadly, to recognize that an effort, a strategy that emphasizes more cooperation versus sort of competition among stakeholders and among the individuals or those who represent the firm is going to win over in the long run, right? So the strategy there is to encourage cooperation from as many stakeholders. Sort of taking that to Veet's question, I find it very, very ironic that in some ways, when firms complain about government and about regulations, and what I think they really mean about that is that there are just too many stakeholders empowered in certain kinds of political regimes. So the more democratic a country, the more stakeholders are empowered through and regulation sort of gives them voice. And then when they go to places where there isn't enough regulation and stakeholders can behave very, very opportunistically, they turn to government and they blame for government for not keeping them in check, and then they sue the government in international arbitration and demand damages for the opportunistic behavior of stakeholders that was not checked by government, right? Which brings me to sort of, I think, one of the things that we need to think more about, and to questions of institutions, to Danny's questions about the process, sort of values, goals, policy choices, which I think is really what you've just mapped out there, the political process that we're seeing unfolding right now during the election, right, with the values being articulated by candidates, the goals that they're associating with those, and then the policy choices that come out of that. I really think it's important to think both about the roles of firms and the role of governments in tandem. There, at least in theory, there's a really nice equilibrium between firms being allowed to focus on what they do really, really well, and that sort of create value, and organizations more broadly create value, and then outsourcing to governments and to the entire political process that has been put in place by governments. Very different types of political processes put in place by in different countries around the world to resolve all these sort of questions about how do we address the bigger problems that come up in the process. I won't take more time because I want to make sure that Sergio and Claudine answer, and maybe we have some.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to talk about, so JW, possible future developments, also the playbook to create external governance mechanism, which also connect with the dependent variable problem in this particular context, and a bit of value. So let's see if I can integrate everything. So in the past 10 years, I have actually done very applied work with policymakers, organizations, nonprofits, even for-profit corporations interested in those social impact issues. And a common practice, common tool in practice is what they, in policymaking, is what they refer to as theory of change, right? So you identify a problem, and then you propose a theory to address that kind of problem, and then you have indicators of problem resolution, their outcomes, right? And so, for instance, I'm collaborating with a nonprofit in the city of São Paulo to develop a local urban area that needs a lot of investment. And there are for-profit firms there. There are nonprofits. There are several organizations. And there are the communities, right? So the idea is, so identify we already did that. You identify the problems, and then you create a theory, which is a set of actions for them to resolve those problems. And then you have your indicators, right? Two comments on that. More recently, I have collaborated with Todd and Tippo because there's also this theory-based view of the firm emerging, which I think is pretty consistent with this practice, right? You start with a problem, you propose a theory, and then you have your indicators. You have your dependent variables, which are indicators of problem resolution. Second, in terms of emergent processes, in a sense, you need to engage those communities in the debate. It's not that they're going to, satisfy every single individual, right? Arrow's impossibility theorem is impossible, but they're going to consider their inputs. So also Leo Pongelupi again. So Leo is very much in this area. We are kind of proposing, right, a research agenda where we involve communities in this process of theorization and so on, right? So in a sense, in terms of value, just to conclude, we cannot, there are different, people have different values, and we shouldn't run the risk of imposing westernized values on people, right? But there's this book by this philosopher, Will Kymlicka, where he says, how can we preserve cultural differences and at the same time guarantee that people are treated well? So he has this principle of, it's a principle of respect and equal consideration, and let those communities have their own self-respect. So listen to them. Right? Engage them in the discussion. You don't need to satisfy, we're not going to satisfy everybody, but you have a more process-based approach. Sorry for expanding on that. So, sorry.
Can I just ask you, what about public bads in that situation? What about exploitative stakeholders or stakeholders that take advantage of that large S?
Yeah, there are studies that will say that you cannot listen to the communities too much because, for instance, they want very low prices for certain types of services. But that's why you have other types of stakeholders, right? You have, have policymakers, you have other companies, then you have this kind of conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that, I'm going to go back to, firstly, these were an amazing set of comments, and in an ideal world, we could all sit around in a circle and have these, equal voice, because there's a lot of great thoughts in the audience. I'm going to go back to the original question, which is on the board here, and try to synthesize a little bit of my takeaways from this conversation. So what would the field of management, or strategy, right? It shouldn't be strategy?
Sure.
Strategic management look like if we took stakeholders seriously? To me, there's two levels of sort of thinking here. One is when you think about sort of traditional firm competition, right? So sort of the original scope of our field, which is, why do some companies, sustainably act differently, sustainably outperform whatever outperformance measures you care about? Why do companies make decisions that they do? I think that the answer to those questions change when you incorporate the idea of different values across different stakeholders and the fact that companies make choices that account for that. And you see that when you talk to CEOs, right? They They make values-based decisions and how their strategies are formed. I see, purpose work that I've done, purpose first, strategy second. And so I think our traditional scope of our field would change if we incorporate these ideas: competition, differentiation, strategic human capital, who we attract, who we don't attract, the customers that we attract, the ecosystems that we can marshal, the cooperation, the type of innovation, all the sort of traditional bounds of questions that we ask. My view is that can be enriched when you think about sort of values type decisions in the traditional bounds. I do think there's a bigger field, which is sort of the expanded scope of our field, which has come up from today as well, which is, okay, that's the traditional scope, but firms are social actors that have social impact, and we should be somehow able to think about not just the P, but the V, whatever the V is, to Adam's stack. And I think there, you have to think about these types of questions. And I think, what I've heard from all three panels today and the discussions in the group is that whether we think that there's some kind of aggregatable social welfare, whether we think that there's some kind of social choice because it's non-commensurable, non-comparable, so there's a social, whatever way we think of social welfare, we can think about that in terms of firms. I just want to do one last comment because we have a couple more minutes. I want to go back to Rafael's question, which is, I think one of the beauties of our field is that we bring people from very different backgrounds. So I was trained in economics. So I think about sort of how do we take the foundations and add to them as opposed to throwing them out. And I do think that there's really very cool and interesting work in both moral economics, social choice theory, that we've underutilized here. And I think our value added relative to that is that we really think about firms, right? So if you take like all the Carnegie School stuff, if firms are ways of aggregating action, right? That's not as present in economics, but it's present for us. So how do we sort of take these ideas of social choice and moral economics, but put the firm, sorry, this is probably not what you want to do, right? But put collective action central, whatever mechanism that is, an organization, a firm, put collective action centrally, and I think that that's what we do really well. I also think that JW and other people here that come from other traditions, Violinas in the crowd, I think that's where we benefit, especially as we can talk to each other, right? An evolutionary perspective, an OB perspective, psychological perspective, those also enrich the conversations. So I know I benefited tremendously when I went to NYU of being in a management department where I could talk to my OB colleagues. I benefit tremendously at Wharton for the same thing. And so I think that type of crosstalk only helps us. It doesn't hurt us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. They have a clock down here, but my clock wins, so.
We started late, so
stop whining, Anita. It's over. I love you. Okay, we're going to take a 30-minute break, and we'll come back.